Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Propagandopolis Podcast. Today I'm speaking with one Spicebag, as he's known online. We're going to be talking about the Northern Irish murals that were painted during the conflict in Northern Ireland, particularly the Troubles that started sort of in the late 60s and lasted until the 90s. Spicebag is a writer and researcher from Ireland. He's the editor of Skag Magazine, an Irish cultural and political magazine, and he is also a designer for Popular Front. As you will hear, he has an immense knowledge of the conflict in Northern Ireland and the many, many thousands of murals that were painted throughout the conflict. And you can find him on Instagram at spicebag.exe. I hope you all enjoy the podcast. So thank you for speaking with me today, Spicebag. I thought we could maybe start off with you doing a bit of scene setting and giving a bit of background information to the conflict. You can go back as far as you want. I imagine quite a few of my listeners will already have an above average level of knowledge of this conflict already. So yeah, explain it away and maybe go up to the Good Friday Agreement.
So the context that we're going to be discussing kind of murals and stuff in the phenomenon of murals in Ireland, political murals and paramilitary murals and stuff like that exists nearly entirely in the British controlled area of Ireland called Northern Ireland. It's not really a phenomenon in the south as much. Where I lived, I'm from the south. I'm from the Republic near Dublin, and in the area where I lived, where I grew up, there was one kind of wall kind of outside on the motorway where I live that would sort of have the names of, say, political prisoners that were in British custody, or different messages kind of, but that was not really on the same level as you'd see in the north there, and there was a couple of things like that around, but on the north is on a completely different level. And I suppose to give a bit of background as to how the island got divided, I'd say most of your listeners for sure will be aware of the conflict kind of between Ireland, the Irish people, and Britain and the English people, and different types of iterations of that conflict have been going on for a long time, very long time. Like the first invasions of Ireland from England were under the Normans. They took place in the 12th century. And then, over the years, there's been various different kind of wars and sort of, events that have kind of driven that conflict along to it's in its current kind of phase now, where there's a country that's the United Kingdom and a country that's the Republic of Ireland, and then there's a divided kind of area in the north. But I suppose what the most relevant thing to that conflict, the most relevant kind of historical background to that would be the plantations, and I won't go too mad into this, but essentially the British decide, or the English decided kind of in the 1600s that they wanted to sort of remove the last vestiges of kind of Irish political structure and power. So Ireland would have prior to that kind of worked as a clan system, kind of similar to the one in Scotland, where there would have been different clans, different families, and they would have kind of ruled over areas of land, and they wouldn't have had any allegiance to the occupying kind of British forces that would have been based around Dublin and the surrounding areas. So the Brits decided we need to break that system, and the way they did it was obviously through conventional warfare, going and fighting these clans. But then later on, they tried a couple of plantations, and essentially what that was bringing settlers from the UK, Protestant settlers, and putting them in areas around areas where there was a lot of kind of Irish identity left, or an Irish political power. And the kind of the worst for that in their eyes was Ulster, the northern province. That was where the most powerful kind of Gaelic lords were based. And after kind of driving them away, they began the Plantation of Ulster, and that that was kind of like a double win sort of for Britain, in the sense that they could change the demographics of the North in favour of the British Crown, but they could also remove kind of unsavoury or on whatever like rebel sort of elements from the border region between Scotland and England. So they could essentially grab these people and that they were kind of having trouble with in terms of like, well, no, just kind of keeping them under control and moving them over, and that created like this kind of separate sort of identity for some people in the North, where they considered themselves British. Like, they don't consider that they were kind of like the colonial addition to the land, and they weren't they didn't consider themselves native. They didn't consider themselves to kind of share a culture with the local population. And then kind of fast forward a little bit, that identity develops. There's a couple more wars and a couple more kind of like, I don't get too much into that because we'd be here all day, but essentially there's a large rift kind of forms between these people. So you have a couple of things like the British government introduced penal laws, which essentially prevented Catholics in Ireland, and Roman Catholic would have been the religion of nearly all the native Irish population. So Catholics were essentially banned from a bunch of things. So they weren't allowed, attend school. They weren't allowed to own weapons. They weren't allowed to own horses. They weren't allowed to own land in some cases, that kind of thing. And essentially creating this kind of apartheid sort of system. And this is something that actually Protestants in Ireland were also subjected to, Presbyterians and stuff, like other kind of varieties of Protestant that weren't in favour with the government in England. But this created a massive divide, and then I think Presbyterians kind of got these laws taken away sooner. They were kind of emancipated first, and then it wasn't until like much later, like the 1800s, that Catholics were fully emancipated. So yeah, you have this massive divide essentially between the two groups, and for this entire time since the kind of plantation, or since say 1800, where Ireland was officially incorporated into the union of like the United Kingdom, there wasn't really like as much of a visible division. Like, there wasn't really Irish nationalism. There had been a few revolts, and there was kind of an idea of like sovereignty, but I guess like that would have happened in a time where nation states in Europe were only sort of starting to coalesce in the sense that we know them today. So that like the idea of Irish nationalism and Irish independence only really started coming into play kind of at the end of the 19th century. So you had a couple things going on then. So as people were sort of coming to this conclusion that they kind of wanted to be independent, and this started picking up steam, there was a sort of Gaelic revival. A lot of Irish culture had either been made illegal, so it actually been made criminal to, speak Irish, that kind of thing, or like essentially the culture had just been kind of destroyed. The famine didn't help. In the 1840s there was a huge famine where Ireland's population dropped by half, and it still hasn't recovered to the number it was at in 1840. And all these things kind of combined together to really damage Irish culture and Irish identity. And at the turn of the century then there was this movement to kind of re-establish Irish culture, and you see this in like a lot like Irish literature at the time, kind of J.M. Synge and Yeats, and who like these kind of people, they would have been involved in kind of the literary aspect of this. Then you would have had the Gaelic Athletic Association, so essentially like the native sports of Ireland started to be played again and stuff, and this kind of created a movement across the country where people started identifying fully kind of as Irish again. The language started being spoken again, that kind of thing, and this sort of set them apart from the descendants of these kind of planters in Ulster, who would have considered themselves very much like not a part of that culture. So yeah, there was a couple of things that happened, I suppose, that are relevant as well. Home rule came onto the cards in the 19th century. Towards the end of the century, people started advocating for home rule. So rather than independence, they just wanted home rule, like Canada or another region of the British Empire. And this was put through a parliament twice, but it was vetoed twice by the House of Lords, and then it was put through a third time. And I think it's a rule. I'm not sure if it's still a rule, but I think it was a rule at the time that if something is vetoed 3 times by the House of Lords, then it automatically becomes law, because it's like, you know, it's going through Parliament and then getting vetoed. So people obviously want it. So essentially, by 1912, the Home Rule Act had been vetoed twice, and that meant that in 1914 it would come into effect. So Ireland would become like a self-governing entity as part of the British Empire. And this caused a lot of kind of anxiety in the community, like the Protestant Unionist community in the north. So in 1912 they created this kind of, what would you call it, like a petition nearly, or like a petition kind of. It was called the Solemn League and Covenant, and essentially it outlined kind of this danger to the material wealth of Ulster, which is the province of Ireland that is the northern part of it, where they live. They thought Home Rule was an extremely bad idea, and they kind of said in it that there's 100,000 kind of men in Ulster ready to fight against this Home Rule Act if it happens. And I think about 500,000 people signed it, and this was a big kind of I suppose the first kind of show of force to the Irish identity, and the British government, like they wanted to resist. They wanted to remain kind of this self-governing region of Britain. They didn't want to be taken away into a self-governing kind of Catholic state. Obviously the Home Rule Bill didn't end up happening because 1914, the First World War breaks out. There's not really much time to start kind of rejigging the governmental kind of structure of Ireland, so it just kind of gets swept to the side. A lot of people are very fucked off about that in Ireland. A lot of people go to fight from both communities. A lot of loyalists go to fight. Obviously, for Britain, they and you know, fight in places like France and all. A lot of Irish nationalists also go to fight, and in the hopes that kind of by doing this they'll get a reward of Home Rule afterwards. And about halfway through the war, the sort of unexpected happens. In 1916, there's a rising in Dublin. So Dublin is the capital of the Republic of Ireland, and there's a rising. So members of a couple of groups, the Irish Citizens Army, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and the IRA kind of, and the Irish Volunteers attack kind of different areas around Dublin. So they seized the GPO, the General Post Office. They seized the Jacob's Biscuit Factory. They seized a lot of streets, and essentially the Brits respond by sending a lot of soldiers, artillery. They send a gunship up the Liffey, which is the river that runs through Dublin, and they kind of start shelling these guys, and eventually they kind of round them up. After a couple of days of fighting, round them up, take them to Kilmainham jail, and then they just kind of shoot them all without asking kind of a trial or any kind of the due process that kind of would be expected. And that turns a lot of people on to the idea of Irish independence. I think prior to that, even while the Rising was happening, like, it's billed in Ireland as quite a patriotic sort of event, sort of like where the nation sort of rose up. But I think in reality it was more a few people with a kind of very radical agenda decided, fuck this, we're going to attack the British state, and we're going to get independence. And a lot of kind of passers-by or just people who weren't involved were like, what the hell is going on? Like, they didn't want anything to do with it. They were like, what is going on? They thought it was kind of more terrorism maybe than I think. But once those people were killed and kind of turned into martyrs, and it kind of demonstrated the sort of brutality or the lack of conscience that the British kind of deal with the Irish in a lot of situations. I think a lot of people were like, okay, and they were on board with that idea. And then this obviously raises tensions further in the north, because now it's not just a home rule situation you're looking at, it's an independent state situation potentially on the cards, and they don't want to get dragged into an independent Catholic state where they feel their identity will kind of be destroyed. So yeah, at that point you would have had the first murals going up around that time. I'll get into kind of the timeline of murals a little bit later, but essentially that kind of war of independence kind of snowballed into a civil war when the British offered a treaty. So the British offered a treaty saying essentially like Ireland could be independent. There was a couple of stipulations like recognising the British monarch as the head of state, and handing over a lot of ports for military kind of stuff, and also ceding the 6 counties in Ulster. So Ulster being a province where there's 9 counties altogether, Irish people in the Republic would consider like all of Ireland generally as Ireland. Like, so yeah, there's 4 provinces, 9 counties in Ulster, and 6 of them are under British occupation, and they're the ones that these kind of loyalists in the north wanted to kind of hang on to. And this was made a sort of part of that treaty that the Irish Republicans were offered in the south, and this caused a split between pro-treaty IRA, anti-treaty IRA. Eventually the anti-treaty got beaten and the Irish Free State was formed. Then eventually nearly every other provision of the treaty were dropped. So there was no, we stopped recognising British monarch as the head of state. We took back the ports, all that stuff, and Ireland started kind of drifted apart a lot from Britain. And in the north, this kind of caused sort of like a Cold War situation where the North was founded on the principle that it was a Protestant state for a Protestant people. And that was something that they kind of wanted to hang on to. Like they didn't want anything to do with the South. And for years, neither country kind of recognised the other. I don't think it was until the 60s that any diplomatic contact or even recognition of the other's existence was kind of made. In the 1960s, in the north, obviously you have these kind of Protestant people who consider themselves British, but then about half of the population is Irish people who consider themselves Irish, and these people are still subject to sort of second-class citizenship. In the north, the country isn't really for them. They're kind of, they wouldn't be allowed to work certain places. They wouldn't be allowed to make any display of their identity, that kind of thing. And like kind of just kind of sort of an apartheid structure in the north for Catholics. And this started creating tension in the 60s, and resulted in kind of a civil rights movement taking off, and the sort of violent response to that by the British authorities in Northern Ireland, and then also the British state later on, kind of spiraled it into like a full-scale conflict, low-intensity conflict in terms of like there wasn't actually, tanks and shit going around, but there was, people were getting blown up every day of the week. There was constant shootings, massacres, paramilitaries fighting each other, and that kind of continued. That continued up until the late 1990s, and eventually a peace agreement was signed in 1998, so the Good Friday Agreement, and that sort of, I wouldn't say ended or solved the troubles in Northern Ireland, but it certainly, plugged the leak of, bloodshed and conflict, and gave Catholic nationalists and Protestant unionists and everyone in between the ability to kind of participate in the government and use kind of words instead of AK-47s and stuff to kind of get their point across. And it's probably still unstable, but it's a lot fucking better than it was, like in a massive way. So that's kind of the full run-up of the kind of recent history.
If we could jump back a century or so, you mentioned that the first murals began to appear around the time of the Home Rule crisis, which is sort of the early 1910s. From what I remember reading, it emerged in Protestant loyalist communities around that time, and the murals tended to celebrate things like the Battle of the Boyne and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I think the first mural, like the first recorded mural, was put up in 1908, and that was kind of in the run-up to this sort of Home Rule crisis that they were kind of coming up against. And the use of the kind of William of Orange motif is I think it's the most widely spread. It's the most commonly used over the course of the entire history within loyalist murals is imagery revolving around William of Orange, or if there's a couple other things as well, but William of Orange is a very important kind of figure. William of Orange being the Protestant king who fought King James, who was the Catholic king, at the Battle of the Boyne in 1698, and he won, and this became like kind of a July 4th moment for Ulster loyalists in the sense that they'd beaten the Catholic Irish, they'd beaten, and then now they had a claim on the land, and he's kind of a huge symbol of that kind of identity. So the first murals go up of him, and it's kind of this expression of, we're us. He wouldn't have been overly important to any other community except theirs. So he's very much a symbol of this community, and they start throwing up murals of him, and they're actually the only people who put up these murals. So obviously they, like, as you get closer and closer to partition, and then after partition, the kind of frequency of these goes up, and it's kind of to identify a Protestant area. And this happens a lot more when Catholic workers, say like rural Catholics, start to move into the industrial centres of Belfast and such, and look for work. This kind of creates a little bit of competition, and there's obviously friction between the two identities. So neighbourhoods are already at that stage very segregated between, Protestant workers and whatever, and then Catholic workers, and then like to distinguish between the two communities, they use symbolism like that. But it was actually only loyalist murals that went up for most of the 20th century, and that has a lot to do with the kind of sort of segregation and the sort of oppression faced by the nationalist community. Like it wasn't allowed, it wasn't cool with the Stormont government to display anything Irish. It was even signed into law, I think, in like 1952 or 1954. The Flags and Emblems Act that essentially prevented any Irish imagery from being displayed publicly. So you couldn't paint on a wall anything Irish. Like you wouldn't get away with putting any sort of Irish imagery up, displaying Irish flags in public. It became a jailable offence to do any of that. And So it would have been fine for, say, a British person to go and do that on a wall, but if a Catholic person was caught doing that, they'd be sent to prison and that kind of thing. And it wasn't actually until the 80s that you start to see Republican murals being kind of put up. The first nationalist murals kind of all exploded over the summer of 1981. So this was into the height of the conflict. So at that point you would have had loyalist murals everywhere, Battle of the Boyne, Red Hand of Ulster, Union Jacks, all that kind of shit all over the walls in loyalist areas, but there was nothing else in nationalist areas. But in 1981, kind of as the hunger strikers, for anyone who doesn't know, so in 1981 there was a hunger strike in Ireland anyway, kind of very famous hunger strike, in which a good few, I haven't got the exact number off the top of my head, but a lot of political prisoners essentially started a hunger strike against the kind of change of their status from political prisoner to just kind of criminal. So essentially Margaret Thatcher had changed these Republican prisoners' status from, political prisoner and all the rights that entails, all the kind of, you're treated better, to criminal. So you will be treated the same as a murderer or a rapist or something like that. And they started hunger striking against that. A lot of protests were kind of tried, like dirty protests, like kind of not cleaning the cells, and then not accepting the food, and eventually there was no budge from Westminster, and the hunger strikers died. Most famous out of them is Bobby Sands, who was actually elected as an MP, I think for West Tyrone, to Westminster. So he was a sitting member of the British government, and he was starving to death in a British prison, and that kind of, I think, was sort of another watershed moment, similar to the prisoners being executed after 1916. Bobby Sands kind of just starving to death, and the British government kind of not really caring or acting in any way, shored up way more support for the cause, the kind of nationalist cause. And that summer there was a huge kind of influx of murals in Republican areas and nationalist areas, so they started doing it too. And the first Republican murals would have been paramilitary murals. So there would have been the IRA, it would have been the hunger strikers, or it would have been other groups like the INLA, things like that, stuff of a very kind of intimidating sort of nature, or like serious nature, and then that prompted the kind of Protestant community to respond in kind, and they started putting up their own murals of UVF or UDA or their paramilitaries, and it sort of became a very the landscape sort of changed from these sort of cultural artifacts to being these very military kind of things to demarcate the territory of certain groups. And another thing you see with the loyalist side around that time as well is the shift to kind of covering everything in paramilitary murals, and you start to see a little bit of a drop off of the traditional kind of British murals around that time, like the Battle of the Somme and maybe the Union Jack and stuff, because at that time a lot of these groups would have also been at odds with the British security forces. There was a lot of, obviously not to the scale not to the scale of conflict as between the Irish Republicans and the British government, but there was conflict between the loyalists and the British government as well. So you start to see more of a paramilitary kind of identity sort of forming in the loyalist community around that time. And yeah, there's like a few of these like are really really famous ones. Like there's obviously a few very famous ones of kind of the hunger strikers and stuff like that. But I think one of the most striking ones in Belfast is the Shankel Mona Lisa, which is this big mural on the Shankel Road, which is kind of the heart of Loyalist Belfast. And it's the heart of Loyalist territory, and it's kind of the local paramilitary group, or the paramilitary group that controls the area is the UDA, and essentially this Shankel Mona Lisa is a big kind of mural of a man, like a UDA man in a camo jacket and a balaclava, aiming down the scope of a gun, and no matter where you stand on the street, the barrel of the gun follows you, kind of like the eyes in the Mona Lisa. And that's a fairly famous kind of paramilitary one, and then there's tons of others, like mainly kind of featuring like men in balaclavas with AKs or RPGs or even kind of people, especially towards the end of the kind of conflict, people who had done pretty messed up stuff. Like there's murals in Loyalist areas commemorating people like Michael Stone, who was a pretty notorious kind of killer, who kind of most famous for attacking an IRA funeral, a Republican funeral, and throwing grenades into the crowd and that kind of thing. Not a very nice man. Most recently, actually, he attempted to break into Stormont and kill some politicians. Some pretty freaky photos of that after he was released from prison recently.
And that was within the past few years.
Yeah. Like he was in there since, he was put in there in the 90s, say, and or the 80s, and he was only released not in the past few months now. I think it might have been 2014. He tried to get in, and it's pretty intense stuff. And then another one would have been Top Gun McKeague. There's a mural kind of commemorating him, and like he would have been a pretty prolific kind of killer of civilians more than anything else. I think he killed about 15 Catholics, and that was the point where the conflict sort of started descending into like really psychotic sort of ethnic conflict. And that those kind of people being depicted on murals kind of shows a shift, from like gone are the days of King Billy on his horse and all this kind of flowery Great Britain stuff, and now it's very much these paramilitary figures who are pretty animalistic people being displayed.
So would you say that the bulk of the murals painted during the peak of the Troubles were sort of deliberately provocative and supposed to be intimidating?
Yeah, and there's kind of a split in the murals. So in 1985, one of the Republican political prisoners was released, and his name was Gerard Mulcara Kelly. Mulcara being the Irish word for my friend, or the Irish words for my friend, which is like a nickname. And he was released from prison, and in prison, political prisoners would have, in the Republican wing of the prison, they would have really tried to kind of focus their Irish kind of identity. So there would have been a lot of Irish language kind of, a lot of people went in there and they came out fluent in Irish. Like the word for someone who speaks Irish in Irish is Gaelgar. These people would kind of be jokingly referred to among Irish speakers as jail gors, because they learned their Irish in jail. So there was a lot of kind of emphasis on that, and Irish literature and Irish art. And Gerard Kelly was he would have learned a good bit of kind of artistic stuff like Irish art, actually from studying the work of Jim Fitzpatrick. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a very famous Irish artist. He created the image of Che Guevara that you see everywhere on, like, lighters and shit, like everything, the flag, just that kind of black print out face of Che Guevara. But he also did a lot of kind of Irish mythological kind of stuff, and Jared Kelly would have studied that in prison, kind of recreated on whatever they had handy, like toilet paper or grease paper, that kind of stuff. And when he got out, he started painting murals. So this and other artists kind of followed him in this, but it created kind of a shift between, or a split between the two communities. So the loyalist side continued putting up these paramilitary murals, commemorating commanders or kind of issuing threats. And the Irish kind of nationalist side started kind of branching out into other things. So you started to see like Irish mythology taking a huge kind of role in a lot of the murals. Like a lot of them are like really, like Cú Chulainn or Fionn McCool, or the Children of Lear kind of myths, or Irish myths and legends. Some of them would be completely unrelated to conflict, like Gaelic Athletic Association murals depicting like sports like hurling or whatever. This kind of diluted it a bit on the Republican side. So there's obviously still these big kind of paramilitary murals around, but there's a lot of these kind of cultural murals as well. Whereas the loyalist side didn't really get on that buzz. There was a few attempts at kind of like mimicking it, I think, on the loyalist side. For example, like the loyalists have a few murals up of Cú Chulainn. I don't know if you know who Cú Chulainn is, but essentially he's kind of the Irish equivalent of like Hercules or some figure like that. He's kind of a famous mythological figure from the Ulster cycle, so he's like very much embedded in Irish mythology, like, and his name means the Hound of Cullen, and it's the whole story there. But very Irish character, and the loyalists kind of started to attempt to hijack that at some point. There's a couple of them, it didn't really take off, but there's a few loyalist murals around that are kind of a bit of a mindfuck, because it's like, no surrender, forgotten Ulster, and then it's a picture of Cú Chulainn, and it says like defender of Ulster or whatever. And I think they sort of at some point decided they wanted to try and kind of rebrand Cú Chulainn as some sort of loyalist, which doesn't really make a huge amount of sense, but there's a few of them up. Didn't go too well, kind of. I don't think it really meshes too well with the ideology, especially seeing as he's very much ingrained in Irish culture. But other than that, you don't see a huge amount. There's a few, kind of weirdly enough, the loyalists have sort of a tendency as well to create murals with cartoon characters, sometimes dressed up as like loyalist band members, like kind of in traditional kind of military outfits or paramilitary outfits, like Bart Simpson or like some of the Looney Tunes and stuff, which is kind of strange, but they'd be up around the place as well. Less common now, but that was a thing that they went through. But for the most part, there isn't a huge amount of loyalist murals that aren't military focused, if that makes sense. They're nearly all related to paramilitary stuff, or even just like normal military stuff, like the Battle of the Somme, remembering shit from like World War II or whatever. But there's definitely a split, and there's way less military kind of style murals now on the Republican side. There might be a couple kind of around the place that you might see, but for the most part, the Republican side kind of has embraced sort of more cultural murals and stuff like that.
Yeah, and some of the more famous nationalist murals, you mentioned Che earlier, often depicted international revolutionary figures. Some of the more famous ones, I remember have, for example, Che. There's that really famous one with Che. There's also one with Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. And I also posted one last week that had Emiliano Zapata, the Mexican revolutionary, James Connolly, and somebody else. I think there was a bit of controversy over who it was. It was either an American Farm Workers Union member or a generic Black Panther supporter. But yeah, I was wondering whether we could speak quickly about the sort of the place and prominence of these international revolutionary figures in mostly nationalist murals in Northern Ireland.
So there's a lot of, and it's exclusively really on the nationalist Republican side, the kind of Irish side of things. There's a lot of solidarity with other kind of revolutionary movements and just revolutionary figures, civil rights movements, all that stuff around the world, because I guess if you were to, like, without being biased, but if you were to frame the conflict, I guess the Republican side is the oppressed side. People would argue with me now about that, but historically that's exactly the truth. They were subject to second class citizenship all the way into the 20th century, all the way up to the 1960s. And then an armed struggle against a extremely powerful government who didn't want to cede any sort of freedoms to them, or that kind of thing. So they definitely find themselves kind of aligned with movements like Palestine. There's a lot of kind of movement, or not a lot of kind of murals that display like pro-Palestinian stuff, or even like fighters, IRA fighters, and then Palestinian fighters, or like ETA in the Basque Country. There'd be a lot of kind of solidarity with those. Catalonia, even like organizations like the FARC, all that kind of stuff. And then also like just, Frederick Douglass. There's a Frederick Douglass kind of mural in Belfast. It's quite famous. Kind of anti-slavery figure. And then who else do you have? Nelson Mandela. There was a lot for him. All that kind of stuff, and that's really tied into the fact that the Republican struggle is a struggle for civil rights, freedom, liberty, that kind of stuff. You don't really see that on the other side. Actually, sorry, and this continues now. This isn't just old news. Like, there might be less, support for ETA and stuff now, but you get recently with the stuff that's going on in Gaza, you'll definitely see a lot of solidarity with Gaza murals. If there isn't already loads of them up, at the time of recording this, there will be. And then like last summer you saw George Floyd, stuff like that. So it's solidarity, sort of. There's definitely an attitude, not just in the north either, like all over the Republic, of I guess supporting these causes. Like, I'm very like in a hardcore way, like, because Ireland is Europe's only post-colonial state, and that's kind of shaped the attitude of people, I think, in Ireland to get really angry, or at least get really supportive of kind of causes, struggles for freedom, or struggles against power or oppression, all this kind of stuff. You don't really see that on the loyalist side as much, interestingly enough, because of the support for Palestine, which has been a long-running thing. You'll often see kind of Palestinian flags displayed with Irish tricolours as a sign of solidarity, but that means in loyalist neighbourhoods automatically you have to see the Union Jack displayed alongside the Israeli flag, and then there was one occasion where the Israeli flag was displayed alongside the Union Jack, beside I think it might have been an SS flag, or like some sort of Nazi flag, because there's obviously a white supremacist element to loyalism as well. So that was kind of a weird one. Kind of weird flags to display together, an Israeli flag and an SS flag. But there's a bit of that around. There's a lot of support for Israel on the loyalist side. I'm not sure they politically care really or know that much generally about it, or they're that invested in the conflict. I think it's more just because the other side likes Palestine. It's sort of like a football team sort of mentality. They just, then they pick Israel. There would have been a lot of support for like maybe other kind of things like Rhodesia, anything you can think of where like
like South Africa as well.
Yeah.
And did we speak about Gaddafi?
Oh yeah, there's huge kind of respect for Gaddafi as well in kind of nationalist areas, because he would have provided a lot of weapons. He would have been kind of involved in a struggle against British imperialism as well. Whatever you think of Gaddafi, but he kind of decided to back up the IRA and sent them a lot of weapons. So essentially they went from using kind of ancient kind of World War II era weapons to having access to some pretty serious ordnance to go after the British Army with, and that was kind of mostly Gaddafi.
Yeah, and on a side note, how did they even smuggle all of those weapons in?
Just on boats. There was a boat actually captured by the Irish Navy. I can't remember the name of the boat, but it had tons and tons and tons of Libyan weaponry, everything from like fucking AKs to RPGs to heavier stuff like surface to air missiles and like all that kind of stuff. And and there was surface to air missiles and stuff like that, and anti-aircraft weaponry smuggled in from fucking Libya into Ireland, and then kind of used against British helicopters and stuff like that. There was a big relationship with Gaddafi, and it's you kind of see all this stuff depicted on murals. I think now, especially now, given the new sort of era as well, you'll generally see less violent ones, ones depicting paramilitary members. You might see a lot more on the loyalist side, especially in areas where loyalist paramilitaries have control, which is a lot of places. Like some of the loyalist paramilitaries, the UDA for example still has almost 12,000 active members, so they have huge control over a lot of loyalist neighbourhoods. But on the Republican side, I think republicanism hasn't gone away, but it's certainly died down. The provisional IRA has kind of disarmed, and it's not as big a thing anymore. They have political representation in the form of Sinn Féin. So there's less of a need for these kind of big sort of paramilitary shows of strength or the intimidating things. So you'll definitely see a lot more things that might just be like completely unrelated, like I don't know, shit that isn't like anything to do with the conflict being thrown up on murals, or like solidarity things around the world, or mental health awareness and stuff like that. That isn't but certainly on the loyalist side, like if you go into an area like the Shankel or loyalist areas like in Carrickfergus or something like that, you will see fairly serious murals depicting like the usual sort of lads with guns, or like the big red hand of Ulster with some like one they use a lot would be like kind of a British soldier from like World War One, or like an old sort of loyalist guy from the turn of the century or the start of the century, and then you'll see like a balaclava guy, and it'll be like one struggle kind of tying it back to the OG stuff.
Yeah, another question that just pops into my head is who actually painted these murals? Was it did they commission, known professional artists and graphic designers to do it for them, or did they just try and do them as best they could themselves, or was it mostly anonymous? What was the deal?
There's a lot of, so I mentioned Jared Kelly earlier. He would have been a very famous kind of painter of murals on the Republican side. There's known sort of muralists on both sides. A lot of them are fairly anonymous. Obviously, you don't really want a 15-foot UVF man with a sawn-off shotgun on your portfolio. So
yeah, a little signature at the bottom.
Yeah. So a few of them are fairly anonymous. But there is people who are brought in to paint them. Often where they're painted is kind of up to the paramilitary. Like, if you don't want the 15-foot UVF man with a sawn-off shotgun on the side of your house, good luck. Because if it's, if they want it up there, that's where it's going. So like, people from the community generally will paint them. There's varying levels of kind of sophistication. Like, some of them are fairly ropey. You can tell that they're not really done by an artist as such. And then other ones will be extremely intricate on both sides. And they will be done by like kind of someone who's had a good bit of experience doing them. It's an interesting one as well. Like, something I want to touch on was the it isn't just murals in Belfast. Like, it's a weird kind of division. Like, there's the division in identity between the two, between the the nationalists and the loyalists, or the unionists, or whatever, like, or Protestant Catholic, whatever. But it's hard to, I think it's hard to kind of, I don't want to say anything like too pie in the sky, but it's sort of like hard to actually find differences between a lot of these people. And I think that having visual reminders around the areas sort of helps to solidify identity, if that makes sense, or it helps to indicate where territory is, especially in these loyalist areas. Like, for example, I was talking earlier about the Shankel Mona Lisa. That's a UDA mural. Slightly up the road from that would be like a UVF area. So there'd be UVF. I'm sorry, for people who don't know as well, the UDA is the Ulster Defence Association, and the UVF is the Ulster Volunteer Force, and they're two paramilitary organisations that were heavily active in the Troubles on the loyalist side. But those paramilitaries wouldn't be friends with each other. That territory is like kind of marked off, and it's marked off by like little indicators like flags, murals, stuff like that. And then on a wider scale, like, identity is marked off. So a Catholic area will have tricolours, Palestine flags, stuff like that. A loyalist area will have, Union Jacks, Ulster banners, Israel flags, big paramilitary murals. You'll have stuff commemorating the First World War, and you'll also have other things like curb painting, like where they'll paint the curb, the curb along the side of the footpath. They'll paint that, red, white, and blue for the the British side, and then you might see green, white, and orange on the nationalist side, and other things like bunting going up. But yeah, it's a weird one as well, because like your it's using people's like everyday landscape as sort of a war zone, like their visual like reality as a theatre of kind of combat between these two ideas. And that can extend to loads of other things as well. That could extend to your school uniform. If you go to a Catholic school, you're marked off as part of that group. Likewise, the other way around. Things like where you get off the bus, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of things that are essentially being used to mark out these divisions. And then there's also physical markers of division in Belfast as well. There's huge peace walls, these very big sort of imposing stone walls with then like large like kind of mesh or like fencing at the top, and then nets on on either side, kind of wherever there's residential areas on either side of them to stop projectiles kind of hitting people's houses. And these like walls physically divide like the two areas and keep them segregated, because if they weren't, in some areas that would lead to massive violence, and like we saw that recently with the sea border protest that happened. There was a kind of an outcry of anger against the Brexit process that created essentially the Brexit agreement that Britain and the EU signed. Landed Northern Ireland with a customs border in the Irish Sea. A lot of people in the loyalist community see this as like a step away from union with the rest of Britain. They got very angry about it. They were kind of egged on by politicians, and then what you saw was kind of these riots involving usually teenagers, where petrol bombs, fireworks, pieces of masonry were thrown at the police, sort of other types of makeshift explosives. A bus was hijacked and set on fire. It's fucking mad. Cars hijacked, like the drivers just told to get out, and then while that was happening, paramilitaries evicted, like loyalist paramilitaries started evicting kind of Catholic families. So the tension is still very much there between the two communities. So you like these physical barriers exist, and then also when that kicked off, like that had nothing to do with the nationalist community, like the Brexit negotiations, nothing to do with the nationalist community. But as soon as the rioting started, it ended up at an interface point on Lanark Way between the nationalist area and the Protestant area, and the gates were rammed with a car was set on fire. Kind of youths from the nationalist area ran out to kind of throw things back at the Protestant youths, and you could see how it could quickly kind of spiral into kind of bad stuff if there wasn't actually physical things dividing the two communities.
Yeah, and these sort of incidents aren't, material for murals nowadays, are they?
I was wondering, I kind of wondering that myself, like how, I'm not sure how much of a good look it is to have a bunch of 14-year-olds branding a bus. Like, I'm not sure if that's something you want to paint on a wall in your community. Certainly if someone had died, or being killed by the police or something like that, you'd see it. But I think those clashes, maybe they weren't as sort of glorious as the Battle of the Boyne or something. Like you might get something, I don't know, but as to my knowledge, no, not really.
Yeah, well, to stay in the modern day, since the Good Friday Agreement, any murals that do go up aren't, as you said, as graphically provocative as the stuff you'd see at the peak of the Troubles. There's sort of been, from what I can see, a tourist industry developing around the murals now. People are encouraged to go and see them. I was wondering two questions really. One, is that true? And two, what's the current status of these murals? What's their legal status, especially ones like the Shankel Mona Lisa that you mentioned earlier?
Well, to the first part of that, there's a huge tourist industry kind of around it, because they are visually very striking, and it's very surreal in a sense to see area, like in some areas in Belfast you'll literally have a road, like a street, and as you're walking along it there'll be tons of kind of Irish nationalist murals, like Irish language, Irish culture, whatever kind of social causes, whatever, and then you kind of cross through a little gate, and then on the other side of that gate essentially it just completely changes to remember the Somme, remember these guys, that kind of, and like British identity stuff. And literally it's the same road, it's the same street, and there's kind of like an unspoken, it's marked by a little gate kind of that you can just walk through if you're a pedestrian, but it's kind of like, yeah, it's quite weird. Like I'd highly recommend people go and look at them if you have any interest. And they're not just in Belfast, they're all over the north. I think there's somewhere in the region of 5,000 or three, I don't know, there's a couple thousand in the north, and nearly 700 of those are in Belfast. There's other ones in Derry. The really famous one in Derry is just like the side of a house that says "You're now entering Free Derry." That's often kind of it's kind of a big visual symbol of Derry, and then they're all over the north. There's lots of them, and yeah, some of them are cool because they're artistically very cool looking, like just objectively they're nice, and then others are striking because they're mad looking, like, you know what I mean, like it's they're very violent, or they depict kind of conflict. But yeah, there's a huge kind of tourism industry around them. As for like the status of the murals, like the stuff like the Belfast Mona Lisa and things like that, and other paramilitary murals, like I don't think anybody could take them down, to be honest. Like, you'd want to be fairly well resourced and well armed to get rid of that. People wouldn't let you do that. Paramilitary organizations still have a huge amount of power in a lot of these areas, and to do something like that will be considered an attack on the kind of culture, and that wouldn't fly. Even for the police to go in, would be extremely dangerous. Like, I don't know if you've seen the police vehicles up north compared to the rest of the UK, but they look like something out of fucking Starship Troopers. Like, they're fairly hardcore. They're big kind of Range Rovers with metal skirts to stop you throwing explosives under them. They're completely like fireproof. They're kind of riot proofed. Like, the people, it's a different kind of state of affairs. There's not really anyone that could go, oh yeah, that's that mural's problematic or whatever, like because it would cost probably cost the UK a couple billion in fucking damages by the time you were done taking them down. So yeah, they're like, I think there's a few ones that you might see coming down at times when an area that was staunchly kind of involved in the conflict has kind of moved on a bit. Like, maybe the paramilitary doesn't have as much hold there anymore. They don't really feel as under threat, and you'll see paramilitary murals kind of recede and be replaced with something else. Or you might find areas where parents kind of in the area don't want their children sort of constantly exposed to this, and if they have any kind of sway, they might they'll still observe the kind of loyalist traditions and or the Republican traditions, but they won't they'll sort of direct the focus maybe away a little bit from direct military confrontation. Like, obviously in the north you have some pretty insane kind of traditions, one of them being like the 12th of July, which is the probably the most stressful event for a law enforcement officer on earth to be involved in. Essentially, loyalist communities all over the north march. Organizations like the Orange Order, which is sort of like a Protestant supremacist kind of order, and all these kind of they're like kind of flute bands or whatever. Like, they're like each loyalist area will have a flute band kind of like playing music and marching in uniforms and banging drums, and they'll be followed by members of the community. And then often these parades kind of go into nationalist areas because they want to walk there, because they traditionally have walked in that area, and then the police have to come in. There has to be hundreds of police to stop it kicking off and that kind of thing. And then at the end of the day, they build these, or they had like in the weeks running up to it, they build these absolutely gigantic bonfires with pallets, like wooden pallets, and some of them are so huge that the like whatever the council, the local authority, will try to get them taken down, because essentially it's like some of them are very, very big, and if it was to go on fire and fall, it could you could see it falling onto like someone's house, and that kind of thing. Like, they're big, and essentially they wait until the 12th of July, and then they kind of cover it in maybe what are those things called, where you kind of make a little thing of somebody and beat it up, an effigy, yeah. So effigies of whoever they don't like, maybe a Sinn Féin politician. They'll use the election posters of Sinn Féin politicians. They'll burn Irish flags and burn stuff like that, and they'll set them on fire. And then on the Republican side as well, you'll see murals also being constructed with British flags and say things like the flag of the paratrooper regiment who committed a lot of war crimes in the north, things like that, or Israel flags and stuff. So they everybody ends up burning bonfires, and then often there's kind of violence and rioting and stuff like that. So
I see. So a lot of these murals are essentially untouchable then. Yeah,
there's it's a different state of affairs. Like, there's a careful balance between government authority, and it's kind of like what's worth, is it worth just letting it be up, or starting World War III? Like, sometimes you're better off just letting this happen, because it's easier than people getting hurt. Like, it might be a terrible kind of sentiment they have. Like, they might be it might be a Republican mural commemorating somebody who bombed civilians in the UK, or it might be a loyalist mural commemorating someone who murdered Catholic mourners at a funeral. But it's easier to just let them have it up, because it's better than people fighting. And it's the same with the bonfires, same with the marchers. It's you could stop it in maybe London, you could crack down on it, but in the north it wouldn't be worth it, and you're kind of constantly playing this kind of balancing act between peace and violence, and you don't want to tip the scale. So there's not much like previously the British government would have knocked down quite a few nationalist ones while the conflict was on, and they would have preserved a lot of loyalist ones that even if they were in nationalist areas or they're falling down, like government money would have been invested in preserving it, or even moving the wall that the mural was on when the rest of the building is gone, that kind of thing. But I think now it's kind of whatever. Like, I don't think there's too much
I see. And this is the case even with the sort of loyalist paramilitaries that might have at one time been at odds with the state. Their murals were sort of left untouched.
I think the state itself has only sort of begun to balance. And when I talk about the state, I don't mean Britain, I mean the Stormont Assembly, I think is only sort of now sort of being balanced properly between nationalist and unionist. But prior to that, unionist politics would have had quite a big sway, even at the like kind of local level. So you could imagine like what a planning authority that was entirely staffed by people of a unionist background would think about a provisional IRA mural, that kind of thing. But I think now it's sort of getting towards maybe some sort of cohesion. That depends actually now as well, as the largest unionist party in the UK has elected a new leader who is like kind of staunch creationist and sort of racist person. So it could quickly recede back into kind of political deadlock. But I think at the moment it seems to be sort of working. Definitely better than it has any time prior to now.
Was this the person you wrote your Vice article about last week?
Yeah. Edwin Poots, absolutely insane character. But he's essentially been elected as the leader of the DUP, which is the largest kind of unionist party. And that's maybe not a good sign. That could be a bad sign for dialogue between the two parties. And between the DUP and Sinn Féin, and it could create a lot of instability, especially if unionist voters don't want to vote for a creationist and a homophobe. They might kind of move away, and that might kind of start destabilizing the political kind of balance, and that could result in actual instability, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's all kind of, it's fine, it's okay now. Like there's not an active conflict, but it's still kind of, it's definitely not at a stage where it couldn't. You could see, like, no, I don't think it could get as bad really as it was in the past, but there's definitely a propensity for violence to kind of break out at certain points, that kind of thing.
I see, right. Well, I think we should probably wrap up around now. As with any subject, I think you said at the start, we could probably spend all day, all week talking about this. But I think you've done a very decent job of explaining it as comprehensively and as neutrally as one plausibly can. So yeah, I just want to thank you again, mate, for speaking with me today. It's been fascinating,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, man. Thanks for having me on. No, class. That was good.
Thanks so much to everyone for listening. That was Spicebag, who you can find on Instagram at spicebag.exe. That's at spicebag.exe. This is episode 2 of the Propagandopolis podcast. The first one was released last month and was on Soviet anti-religious propaganda. As I mentioned at the start of the podcast, if you want to support the podcast and the page, I have set up a Patreon. So that's patreon.com/Propagandopolis. I think the lowest tier is something like £3 a month. There are higher tiers where you can get like discounts for prints, early access to limited run prints, even a free book if you go for the top tier one. Obviously, the more Patreon subscribers I get, the more I'll do. I have a few more podcasts in the pipeline at the moment. As I mentioned at the start, the next one's looking like it's going to be on the Napoleonic Wars, specifically the Peninsular War. That should be pretty cool. Anyway, once again, thanks for listening. Anybody who's still listening now is an MVP. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and hope you'll enjoy the next one as well.